The highway stretched ahead, a black ribbon against the dark, seemingly endless and foreboding. The wind howled through the trees, their branches swaying like skeletal arms reaching out to the night sky. James shivered, gripping the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white with tension. He had been driving for hours, his headlights the only source of light for miles, cutting through the oppressive darkness. Cedar Bridge, 5 miles, his exit, almost home. The thought brought a small measure of comfort. James, the weary traveller, rubbed his tired eyes, trying to stay alert. He had been driving since early afternoon, anxious to get back to his small town after a long business trip. He wasn't a fan of driving at night, especially not on this lonely stretch of highway, but his flight had been delayed, leaving him no choice.
Just a little while longer.
He thought about his wife, Sarah, waiting for him at home. He pictured her warm smile, the way she always left the porch light on for him. He rolled down the window a crack, letting the cool night air wash over him. The weary traveller needed to stay awake. That's when he saw her, a lone figure standing by the side of the road, shrouded in shadow. A hitchhiker. He slowed down, pulling up alongside her. As his headlights fell on her face, he could see she was just a young woman, barely out of her teens. She had large, sad eyes and wore a simple white dress that fluttered in the wind. He wasn't really one to pick up strangers, especially not in the dead of night. But something about her desolate figure tugged at his conscience.
My name is Amy. I'm heading to Cedar Bridge to visit my grandmother. It's been a while since I last saw her, and I miss her dearly. My car broke down miles back. I tried everything, but nothing worked. So, I decided to walk. I've been walking for hours. The road seemed endless, and I was starting to worry that I wouldn't make it before dark. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the road. I felt a chill run down my spine. James listened to her story, his concern growing. He could see the weariness in her eyes. He couldn't leave her stranded. The thought of her being alone on this deserted road was unsettling. He offered her a ride. "Hop in," he said. "I'll take you to Cedar Bridge." Amy thanked him quietly, her voice almost inaudible. She seemed relieved but hesitant. She clutched a small, worn leather bag in her lap. It looked like it had seen better days. James tried to make conversation, asking about her life in Cedar Bridge, but her responses were short, distant. She answered politely but without much detail. It was like she was lost in another world, a world shrouded in shadows. James glanced at her, concerned. He wondered what had happened to make her so distant. She stared out the window, lost in thought. The silence between them grew heavier. The car drove down the dark, empty road, the only sound being the hum of the engine. A single tear rolled down her cheek. James noticed but said nothing, respecting her silence. He drove on, deep in thought, wondering about the story behind her sadness. As they approached Cedar Bridge, the lights of the town appeared in the distance, offering a glimmer of hope.
The old bridge loomed ahead, its metal structure groaning in the wind.
James glanced at Amy, but she was no longer looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the bridge, her eyes wide and unblinking. He felt a sudden chill run down his spine. There was something about her intense stare, something unsettling. Amy said, her voice hollow. "S2, this is it."
"This is where it happened,"
James asked, confused. Amy turned to him, her eyes boring into his. A slow smile spread across her face, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was cold, empty, like the grave.
"This is where I died,"
she whispered. James's eyes widened in horror, his breath catching in his throat. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, leaving him paralyzed with fear. Amy's revelation echoed in his mind, solidifying the chilling truth of the Phantom Hitchhiker.
James slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared at Amy, his blood turning to ice. Her words echoed in the silence of the car.
"This is where I died, James."
He blinked, and she was gone, vanished. The passenger seat was empty.
He jumped out of the car, his breath catching in his throat. He scanned the deserted highway. There was no one there. He was alone. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was he losing his mind? The next day, James went to the local library. He had to know. The events of the previous night had left him restless, and he needed answers to the questions swirling in his mind. He searched for old newspaper articles, local legends, anything about Cedar Bridge. The library was a treasure trove of history, and he hoped it held the key to the mystery. And then he found it. Hidden among the dusty archives, a piece of the puzzle began to emerge. A faded article dated 50 years ago. The paper was yellowed with age, but the story it told was still clear. A young woman named Amy had died in a car accident on that very bridge. The details were hauntingly familiar, echoing the whispers James had heard. The article even mentioned a worn leather bag she had been carrying, a bag that was never found. This small detail seemed to connect the past to the present in an eerie way.
That night, James lay awake in bed, his mind racing. The discovery had opened a floodgate of thoughts and emotions. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had encountered something unexplainable. The connection between Amy's story and his own experience was too strong to ignore. The way she vanished, the article, it was all too much of a coincidence. It felt as if the past was reaching out to the present, trying to tell him something.
A sudden noise from outside his window made him sit up in bed, his heart hammering in his chest. The silence of the night was broken, and his senses were on high alert. It was just a branch scraping against the glass, but it was enough to send shivers down his spine. The darkness seemed to close in around him, amplifying his fear. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the house felt like a whisper. The unease was palpable, and he knew that this was just the beginning of a deeper mystery. As the night deepened, shadows seemed to come alive, whispering secrets of the past. James felt a chill run down his spine as he approached the old, creaky bridge. Suddenly, a figure appeared out of nowhere, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. The air grew thick with tension, and James knew he was not alone. This was the moment of truth, the climax of his terrifying journey. Days turned into weeks, and still, Amy couldn't shake off the memory of that night. It was as if the events had etched themselves into her mind, refusing to fade away. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and fatigue. Perhaps it was the result of too many sleepless nights and the weight of her daily worries. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. It grew with each passing day, fed by the eerie silence of the night and the shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight. Amy found herself avoiding Cedar Bridge, taking long detours even if it meant arriving home late. The thought of crossing that bridge again sent shivers down her spine, and she couldn't bring herself to face it.
James started asking around town, cautiously at first, about the legend of the Phantom Hitchhiker. To his surprise, the story was well known among the locals. Almost everyone had heard the story. It was a tale passed down through generations, whispered around campfires and at family gatherings. Some dismissed it as folklore, a mere ghost story to entertain children. But others, their voices hushed and their eyes wide, swore it was true. They recounted their own encounters or those of friends and family, each story more chilling than the last. They spoke of a young woman in a white dress, seen on lonely highways, always asking for a ride to Cedar Bridge. Her presence was said to be both beautiful and haunting, a spectral figure that vanished as mysteriously as she appeared.
I looked around, but there was no one there. Had I imagined it? Or was Amy, the Phantom Hitchhiker, trying to tell me something about James? I left the bridge that night more shaken than ever, the line between reality and the supernatural blurring before my eyes. One particularly foggy night, I found myself drawn back to Cedar Bridge. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an overwhelming urge to go there, as if James was calling me. As I stood on the bridge, the wind whipping my hair around my face, I thought I heard her voice, faint, like a whisper on the wind, calling my name, and James's too.
The legend of the Phantom Hitchhiker lived on, passed down through generations, a chilling reminder that some roads lead to places beyond our understanding. Was she real, a restless spirit trapped between worlds forever wandering? Or was she a figment of our collective imagination, a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk in the shadows of the night? Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. The next time Amy and James find themselves driving down a deserted highway late at night, they should think twice before offering a ride to a stranger. Subscribe for more and make sure to share if you dare. Stick around for a few more stories.